try to catalog some of the specimens that he collected during his time, and he really pushed hard at this. There's a bit of a danger of the specimens being left in drawers and sort of forgotten, which if any of you have worked in libraries or in the scientific community is still a major problem today. There are still new birds that are discovered based on specimens that were collected in the 1870s. They're just sort of never examined. Anyway, on the 4th of January in 1837, Darwin's first paper was read at the Geological Society of London, and this argued that the South American landmass was actually slowly rising. Again, going back to the seashells that he'd seen, that it was slowly rising. Now, on the same day that he presented that paper, he also took the birds that he'd collected in the Galapagos and he gave them to an ornithologist named John Gould. Now, John Gould examined these birds and said that actually there were 12 separate species of finches. Darwin hadn't taken exact notes on where he'd collected each finch. For the most part, his notes were amazing. But he neglected to say which islands he actually collected the finches from and had to sort of go back and figure out that they were actually from different islands. And this is said to really have not necessarily started the process of him thinking about evolution, but that looking at these similar finches and the seeds and whatnot that he collected really made him identify that there was some sort of evolution based on adaptation that was going on. Now again, just as a side note, a lot of these finches today, the taxonomy isn't exactly clear, and it's thought that there probably aren't actually 12 species there, that it's just small variation within a single species, or it's usually split into about 5 different species, and just variation in the bill size from year to year. But again, that's another question entirely. He also collected different types of rheas. So there are 2 different types of rheas. And he did have good notes on where he collected these birds. The rheas are the big tall birds, a bit like an emu or like an ostrich. And he noticed that the population shifted as you moved south. So it went from predominantly one species of rhea up north, and then as he moved south through South America, it was another species that was more common. So from this, he sort of began to conjecture that there must be some adaptation, that they're feeding on different plants, or there's some sort of environmental factor that's influencing where these different species are living, and that somehow they must have evolved to these different areas where they're living. Now, by July or so of 1837, his notebooks really start to mention these different theories that he's coming up with. So he starts to talk about the variation in offspring to adapt and alter the race to the changing world. So again, that the environmental factors really contribute to how animals adapt. And he started sort of theorizing about natural selection as well. I've talked a bit about evolution and the history of evolution, but natural selection is maybe one of Darwin's greatest contributions to the idea of evolution. Evolution was sort of around, natural selection was, but only in a vague manner. And evolution is sort of the process that happens over time. Natural selection is the means. So natural selection is the way in which evolution works. And that's really where Darwin comes in, really where he makes his largest contribution. Now, he also thought that it was really just completely absurd to talk about one animal as higher on the evolutionary tree than another. So the idea that worms were right next to hell, he thought that was a little bit silly. He didn't think that evolution was deterministic, that it was heading towards a final point in time. And again, this is something that scientists are still sort of grappling with to this day, that the Linnaean system of taxonomy really has that deterministic view to a certain point. My brother-in-law likes to argue cladistics and taxonomy with me to no ends. Cladistics is just a different way of sort of organizing everything, basically. In 1839, Fitzroy publishes his narrative of their journey, this is the second voyage of the HMS Beagle, and Darwin's journal and remarks were sort of added on as a third volume to this publication. However, that third volume had such success that later that year it was actually published on its own as a separate entity entirely. Contemplation. Now, the next 20 years of Darwin's life were sort of spent contemplating these ideas that he had started to foment during his initial exploration aboard the Beagle. He wasn't, of course, completely idle during that time. This is actually his favorite walking path, sort of sand path through the forest here, and it said that this is where he came up with a lot of ideas. But he did publish a number of other books during that intervening 20 years. He worked for about 8 years on barnacles and marine invertebrates. And again, he sort of incorporated some of his ideas about natural selection into his work on these barnacles. He thought that the slight change in the body parts that he was seeing within the different species, again, were functions to meet changing conditions, to meet new conditions based on the different areas in which the barnacles lived. And his work on the barnacles actually earned him a Royal Society's Royal Medal in 1853 and really made his reputation as a biologist. Prior to that, he'd actually been known mostly for geology, was his sort of forte. But he began to become known as a biologist in 1854, so a year after he received the Royal Medal. He sort of resumed his work on natural selection and on his theory of species full time at that point. And during the intervening time, a little bit at the beginning, he was also really heavily influenced by Thomas Malthus, the sort of Malthusian theories of population dynamics, of the limitations to population growth. And Darwin postulated that the increase in population growth would cause a limited amount of resources, and that because the resources were limited and the population was growing, that species would have to diverge, that they would have to adapt to either other resources or figure out some way to manage so that there was less competition for those limited natural resources. And that, again, is sort of an underlying factor within this idea of natural selection. So in 1856, Darwin finds out that he had a bit of competition with his ideas. There's a gentleman named Alfred Russel Wallace. Does anybody know the Wallacea line, sort of separating Australasia, the Australian Papua New Guinea continent, from Western Indonesia? Nope. So Wallace was spending a lot of his time in that area of the world, and he noted that there's this sort of line that passes through where you stop getting the monkeys. Right? Southeast Asia, you get a lot of monkeys, and then there's this line where the islands on one side have monkeys and the islands on the other don't. He also did a lot of work in the Amazon basin, and he really came up with the idea of natural selection sort of on his own, completely separate from Darwin's ideas at the time. But because Darwin had gained such renown as this preeminent scientist, naturalist, biologist, Wallace actually sent his paper to Darwin before it was published, sent it to Darwin, and Darwin ends up passing it on to Lyell, right, from the Principles of Geology. They become very good friends, actually. Passes it on to Lyell, and Lyell tells Darwin that he better hurry up and publish his paper. If Darwin doesn't publish his paper fast,